Good morning, everyone. Let's move, check this works. What we're talking about this morning is a very strange sequence of events. But it wasn't unprecedented. What happened in the opening months of 2020 and really on in a more subdued way, really into the middle of 2021, was that a profession was wrong, more or less in its totality. This profession had gone through a previous episode of humiliation almost, not much before that, in 2008 and 9, when Her Majesty the Queen asked an awkward question at the London School of Economics as why nobody had foreseen the great financial crisis and the Great Recession happen, why nobody noticed this in advance. Anyway, what happened and essentially what was wrong with economics? What happened in beginning in March and April 2020 was the following: that the pandemic emergency was announced. This would plainly have very major economic effects. And there's going to be less output, destruction of jobs. And overwhelming majority of my profession, I'm an economist, is that they said this then meant a few years of disinflation, possibly even of falling prices and deflation. Within 18 months, through 2022, this forecast was contradicted, and instead there was the highest inflation for 40 years in many countries, including the UK. So most of the profession was wrong, as it had been in the earlier episode. There were some exceptions to this. And you can see one of them now, it's me, and another one's just here, which is Juan Castañeda. What we noticed at that time was very fast growth of the quantity of money on what are called broad definitions. I'm sorry, this subject is technical to a degree. Very fast growth of the quantity of money, reflecting decisions, publicly announced decisions taken by central banks and governments. The fast money growth was the consequence of those announcements and the decisions then taken. And all that Juan and myself did was to quantify the implications of these announcements for the amount of money in the economy, essentially the quantity amount of bank deposits, said this is going to lead to an explosion in the growth of bank deposits, and on all past evidence, that meant a serious inflation flare-up. And may I just say that I put out my first warnings about this almost as soon as the announcements came out in late March 2020. The importance of this is that there is a theory which successfully connected those announcements to the outcomes. Call it broad money monetarism, based on the quantity of money. The quantity of money goes back centuries. Why on earth could not this profession of so-called profession of economists not understand this set of ideas which in essence have been around for centuries? And that is the puzzle that we're trying to understand today. What I want to say today, this is a big topic, is that the theories that economists use to explain how the economy as a whole works, macroeconomics, are fundamentally misleading and wrong because they are not representative. They don't describe the real world. I was going to go through 4 examples of that. I'll have to go through very, very quickly. In the background here, there's a lot of politics, and I may talk about that very, very quickly. But anyway, so let me just move on. And I'm sorry some of this is very technical. When I try to explain this episode, much of the blame goes on this thing called three-equation new Keynesianism, which dominates the textbooks. And I have written a book about all this. It's just here. This has just been published, and of course, I'll say it's worth reading. Well, it is worth reading. So, and then what this is associated with is analysis of inflation, which relies upon adding up costs. All right, so that obviously the price of anything depends on the cost of making it plus the profit margin. So you can analyze it that way. That is only part of the story. It's part of the story, but it's only part of it. And it overlooks in particular arbitrage between asset prices and then the prices of goods and services, and it overlooks the quantity of money altogether. You know, we live in Western civilization that's always progressing, isn't it? The quantity theory of money was much more prominent 100 years ago than it is today, and it had to be revived in the second half of the 20th century, revived and it fell away again, and in the 21st century, it essentially vanished from university teaching and I suppose also from teaching in schools. The result is that macro policy, what's done by central banks, is regarded as setting a policy rate. And then, of course, governments can affect the economy, can't they, as well, through something called fiscal policy. My views on fiscal policy are not really for polite company, and so I won't go through them into too much detail. One of the results of this is that this profession doesn't really understand the effect of so-called quantitative easing, quantitative tightening operations on the economy. And I've got to move on quickly, but so one of the results of all this way of thinking is that monetary policy is reduced to the setting of interest rates, with bond yields being in there somehow or other, rather complicated sort of way, never really explained. So then you get to two possible pathologies. One is that suppose the central bank rate has reached zero, can't really go negative, and so there's a zero bound. And then there's a different idea, which is Keynes' liquidity trap, that when the bond yield has fallen to a certain level, there's a risk that bond yields will rise, causing a capital loss. So bond yields can't really go beneath that level. And both of these pathologies then justify so-called expansionary fiscal policy, which means increasing government spending and widening the budget deficit. It doesn't, by the way, these things don't work. So we keep on getting in this profession, they fail to see monetary policy working properly, and then they say we want fiscal policy, we want more government spending, and my God, we've got some of that at the moment. And it all does go back to this chap Keynes and the general theory. So another book that's relevant here is kind of moneyless macroeconomics. The pathologies I've just talked about are rubbish. It is always possible, even with the central bank's interest rate at zero, even at bond yields at levels of 0.5% or 1%, it's always possible for the government to increase the quantity of money. The increase in the quantity of money will always push up house prices and share prices. It will always boost the economy. These textbooks are talking complete tripe, and these two pathologies, which went here in the journals endlessly, are just nonsense. This kind of mainstream stuff has been, there's a book by a chap called Woodford, which came out early in the 21st century, Money and Interest and Prices, and there's an associated article, 2000, Journal of Economic Literature, Keynesian macroeconomics without the LM curve. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the technical way of saying macroeconomics without money and banking, without a banking system, without financial system. Rubbish. This stuff is in general theory, or at least the origins of it are, in a rather complicated way. And it goes, in fact, through the Samuelson textbook, which has been the dominant textbook in the subject since it was written and published in 1948. Went through 19 editions and so on. And all the current textbooks are really Samuelson clones. Very quickly, in this kind of approach, the standard approach, mainstream economics, the economy consists of transactions in the income expenditure output circular flow. I'm not going to explain that now. Every economy has got transactions and assets. The transactions and assets interact with the transactions in the income expenditure flow. If house prices rise sharply, you get an increase in consumption because people feel better off. If share prices rise, companies are more likely to invest than they would otherwise have been because the assets they're producing are worth more. You can't separate out the transactions and assets from the income expenditure flow. However, say the Mankey textbook says that the income expenditure output flow is 100% of the economy. It determines GDP. One has to weep. It may even be the case, I put it possible, that when asset prices rise rapidly, because they have a large increase in the quantity of money, it may even be the case that this is a dominant influence on the economy, and so the effect of asset transactions is by far the most important driver of economic activity. So there we are, one problem that we've got. One of the results of the general theory in the Samuelson textbook is the idea that the only important asset in the economy is one on which there is an interest rate paid, which means bonds, bond yields. So general theory has only one mechanism to connect assets, and that's working through bond yields. It ignores altogether the effect of changes in the quantity of money on the value of houses and the value of stocks and shares, which again to me is absolutely vital. You may think what I'm saying I'm exaggerating. I am not exaggerating. Three-equation new Keynesianism has only one relationship in there to connect policy and aggregate demand, and it works through interest rates, central bank interest rate, in fact, the usual current version, but it goes back to the IS and LM framework, and the IS function usually is actually the bond yield. I'm just telling you, they have got nothing in these stories about the effect of changes in money growth on house prices, share prices, and the exchange rate. And in all the cycles I've been involved in my rather long career now 74, these impacts have been very, very important, the effects on house prices and share prices. In the last episode, and part of what's in my book, is this is American wealth, American households, and it shows the change in the value of these major asset classes in the COVID period. Essentially, I've taken it from 2020, the first quarter, to the end of 2022. Now, this column shows the change in the value of debt securities, bonds, essentially. In the Keynes, it is in the general theory and the Samuelson story in the IS function, it is this that matters to the economy, this column here. What over there I show you is what happened to the change in the value of real estate held by houses, that's mostly houses itself, households, that's mostly houses as such. Then they're holdings of equities, they're holding mutual funds, all it's in America, equity and this is their own in legal partnerships, accountancy firms, corner groceries. And then I top that up with all the variable income assets there, that just next to you can see it at the back. Those numbers there are 45, 104, 1,600, 1,000. They are this multiple of that change in debt securities, and yet my profession looks at that, not those. In the approach to determining this, they look at costs, and then they have something called the expectations augmented Phillips curve. And then they go on to this cost accountancy approach. What they don't do, and I'm sorry, again, this is true of central banks generally, they don't, and indeed academic economists, they don't think that there's some relationship between house prices and prices of goods and services. Let's just be clear. When you build a house, there's some costs involved, all right? There's going to be, the cost of the bricklayer, the cost of the plumber, the cost. Okay, so there's a connection between the price of the asset and the price of the goods and services that go into it. Is it obvious? No. in late 2020, even late 2020, you checked what was going on in housing markets in England, Britain, Cornwall, say Pembrokeshire and Wales. House prices were soaring during COVID. Why? Of course, there's then a connection between that and other prices and so on over a period of time. Because people, we're all here to try and make some money, aren't we? So if you see soaring house prices, then there's going to be some effect on consumption, some effect on economic activity. No, the Bank of England this time was still producing these ridiculous speeches about years and years of disinflation and all the rest of it. They weren't looking at what's going on in the real world at all. So anyway, you see there's a problem. And then this is a rather more detailed point, which arises curiously from exchange with the Bank of England official in recent past. But I actually wanted, as a point of thought, a view of thought, that no, the quantity of money doesn't really do very much because it's determined within the economy, isn't it? It's endogenous. There's a chap called Congdon who produced some theories where if there's too much money in the economy, it's automatically repaid by overdrafts. So you didn't have to look at the quantity of money in a policy-making sense. And what I then just simply did was to check the relative importance of overdrafts in the whole economy as explaining spending. And it turns out that they're terribly unimportant, probably less important now than they were when Congdon was writing, but even then I can't believe they're terribly important. The great bulk of spending is not done on overdraft. It is not done by people adjusting their overdrafts upwards and downwards. It's not done in that way at all. People are spending from money which they have in their bank accounts, and they want to keep that amount of money appropriate relative to their expenditure and their portfolios. So this stuff is all rubbish too, and this actually then justifies a whole mass of thought called post-Keynesianism, in which money doesn't matter.